Nothing was really wrong about the guardian the court appointed to Jinsey, but nothing was all that right about her either. She was what his mother might have called the lukewarm, neither one thing nor the other, but for Jinsey that was all right. He could survive with someone like that. He could get by. For once in his life he didn't have to worry about where his meals were going to come from. He threw himself into his schoolwork and was surprised to find that he enjoyed it, that he even excelled at it. The sort of kids who before had given him a wide berth now began to circle closer, sometimes even speaking to him. One of them, a kid named Henry Wendry, started hanging out around him silently, standing a few feet away from him. During breaks between classes, sitting across from him at lunch, but at first without speaking or meeting his eye. Sometimes he shadowed Jinsey for a few blocks when he walked home. At first Jinsey tolerated it, then he got used to it, then he started to like it. He started to notice when Henry wasn't there, like his shadow or ghost. "What?" Jinsey finally said one day at lunch. "Nothing," said Henry, and then they sat silently for a while until Henry asked, "What music do you like?" "Music?" wondered Jinsey. What did he know about music? Helplessly, he just shrugged. "What about you?" Henry rattled off a few names of bands, then, when Jinsey didn't say anything in reply, began to try to explain what each one sounded like. He was, as it turned out, good at it, capable of talking in a lively and surprising way that didn't really describe the music so much as saying something slant-wise that still gave a sense of what it sounded like. Jinsey was surprised to find he enjoyed listening to him talk. Henry, silent for so long, now seemed unable to be quiet, and later when he gave Jinsey the music to listen to, Jinsey found that the descriptions felt right. Henry was his first real friend apart from his brother, but you couldn't really think of a brother as a friend, could you? How had he gotten to be 15 before having a real friend? Thinking that made him recent in Estevan, which made him feel guilty. Here he was living an okay life with a decent guardian and one real friend, while his brother was wandering alone somewhere out in the domes. He had glimpsed his brother once or twice, usually from far away, though once up close. That time his brother had seemed not to know him. Estevan had not acknowledged him as he went past, and though Jinsey wanted to reach out and speak to him, he hadn't been able to bring himself to do so. He could not if Estevan wasn't going to meet him halfway, but later he wondered if his brother hadn't simply been lost in his private world of patterns and numbers. Maybe his brother was so deep within his own head that he couldn't see Jinsey. His life was like that in those days. It was like he was on a teeter-totter, slipping from a feeling all right, a feeling guilty, and then back again, but never stabilizing. After a few months, he trusted Henry enough to tell him about Estevan. That's your brother?" said Henry. He'd seen Estevan here and there, always from a distance, and didn't quite know what to think of him. "I feel like I should help him," said Estevan. Henry nodded. "Sure," he said. "He's your brother." you have to feel that way." And then he shrugged. "But what can you do?" he asked. "For 6 months he did nothing." "Really?" And then one day, walking home, he was talking with Henry about the apartment building he used to live in, trying to describe it as vividly as Henry had managed to describe not only music but other things since, and finding himself failing to make it come alive. Henry was watching him politely, eagerly even, but he kept tripping and stumbling over his words, unable to make them into images that Henry could understand. Slowly he ground to a stop. Henry watched and waited for him to continue, and when he didn't, simply said, "You could just show it to me." Jinsey thought, why not? So they trekked the mile or so over to the valve that led to the Mariner Valley compound. The valve operator stationed there stared at them inquisitively. "You sure you want to go in there? Two nice kids like you?" he asked from beneath a bristling mustache. "It's a little rough." "I used to live there," said Jinsey. The operator wrinkled his nose. "If I'd lived there and got 10 out, I don't know that I'd be eager to go back," but he let them through. They watched the valve twist close behind them and then walked the 30 meters down the tube to the second valve. By the time they got there, Jinsey was beginning to have his doubts. He had a new life now. He should be moving on. Why would he want to show any of this to Henry? The valve twisted open and they stepped out. To Jinsey, the compound on the other side looked at once familiar, just as he remembered it, and different too. Having changed himself, he could see it for what it was, a slum. The valves were a way of cutting off the Marinara Valley compound in case the people inside decided to revolt. The streets that had seemed normal to him as a child he could now compare to the streets where he currently lived. Everything was run down, a little filthy, a little pathetic. "You live here?" asked Henry. Jinsey shrugged. For a moment he considered turning around, going back to the valve and leaving, but when Henry asked, "So where's your building?" He showed Henry the worn concrete steps, the cracked floor of the hallway leading down to their apartment, and then the door itself, discolored and scraped, ragged along one side. They stared at it. Jinsey didn't know what else to do, and Henry didn't seem ready to go back yet. The door was sealed where it met the frame with police tape. Why, wondered Jinsey. He was surprised that someone new hadn't moved in by now. But looking more closely, he realized the tape had been slit very carefully so that at first glance the door still looked like it was sealed. Henry must have realized that as well, for he reached out and placed his hand on the door's handle and pushed down. The door was not locked. As both boys watched, it slid slowly open. Behind it was the largely empty living room floor, coated now with a thin layer of dust. There was the uneven couch, the small vid screen with its cracked corner, and the makeshift coffee table made from a discarded and bent shipping container that they'd found and then beaten back flat. The wall was discolored, now beginning to go gray, and with mold in the corners, unless it was just dust gathering there. "We probably shouldn't be here," said Jinsey. The memories in the room were palpable to him, most of them bad. "It's okay," said Henry, already poking around. "There's no one here. Even if someone comes, we can talk our way out of it." For Henry, Jinsey realized it was a game. And then Jinsey noticed the path that had been scuffed through the dust from the front door to the entrance to the back bedroom, the room he had and Estevan had shared. He followed the path with his eyes. He could see a little coming from the crack under the bedroom door. He reached out and grabbed Henry's arm. "What?" asked Henry, starting to shake free. "Quiet," whispered Jinsey. "I think someone's here." If he'd only turned and left, things might have been different, but he didn't. Why? Perhaps because Henry was there with him, and that for Henry that this was still an adventure. Knowing someone was there made it even more of an adventure for Henry. It was simply an escalation of the violation that had begun when they found the police tape slid over the door. They were sneaking in, and now they were risking something, but from Henry's perspective, probably the worst that could happen was they might get scolded or warned off or kicked out. Or maybe at very worst turned into the authorities for trespassing and then released with a reprimand. But Jinsey had grown up in this neighborhood. He knew it could be much worse, that if the wrong person was in the back room, they might end up badly hurt or even dead. And so when Henry started moving forward deeper into the apartment, Jinsey was not quick to follow. He watched his friend go, his feet tracking a new path through the dust until he stood beside the bedroom door. Maybe, thought Jinsey, there would be nobody there. Maybe someone had come and gone but left the light on. But as Henry reached out and touched the door's handle, Jinsey knew that he was fooling himself. And indeed, before Henry could open it, the door opened of its own accord, and a blotchy arm reached out and jerked him through. Jinsey started for the outer door, already beginning to run. But there was nowhere to run, nobody to tell, until he had gone through the valve and into the larger city. By then he would be too late. Henry would either be dead and lying broken on the floor when he got back, or he would have been carried away and would be gone. And so, barely out the door, his feet slowed. He stopped and he turned back. He was big enough, he told himself, and tough too, and he had grown up here and knew how to fight. If he could just get a jump on whomever it was, there might be a chance for both him and Henry to get away. He quietly approached the door to the bedroom and carefully pushed the handle down until the tongue slid out of the lock's groove. He could hear a voice inside whispering, insistent. Taking a deep breath, he threw the door open and rushed in, fist already cocked and ready to strike. On the floor, kneeling on top of Henry, holding him down, keeping him from struggling, hand clamped over his mouth, was a filthy man. His hair and skin were wretched and stinking. "Who sent you?" he heard him whisper loudly, without lifting his hand from Henry's mouth to let him answer. "What do they want from me? Why are they after me?" And then Jinsey was on the man clipping him in the ear and knocking him enough askew that he turned and shifted his balance, and Henry began to wriggle free. But at the same moment, the man turned, and Jinsey was surprised to find that his was a face he recognized. It was Istvan. But though he recognized Istvan, his brother didn't recognize him. His eyes were glazed crazy even, and as he half fell, half clambered off Henry, it seemed almost like his brother wasn't there at all. It was like it was just his body, but with someone else or even something else in charge. Henry had managed to scramble to his feet, Istvan stumbling, gathering his balance against the wall, and then bared his teeth. Istvan said, "Jinsey, it's me." Istvan made a noise that was kind of snarl, his eyes darting everywhere, looking perhaps for some hidden pattern, but as a result unable to see what was in front of him, and then he ducked his head and charged. He struck Jinsey hard right in the center of the chest, knocking him off his feet, coming down hard on top of him. For a moment, Jinsey had the awful feeling of suffocating the room, fading around him, and then he managed to suck in a deep, pain-racked breath. Istvan was on top of him, striking out, pummeling his shoulders and neck and face with his fists. Henry was behind him, trying and failing to tug him off. "Istvan," he tried to say again. "It's me, Jinsey," but nothing came out. He tried to grab Istvan's hands, but failed. He tried to protect his face with his forearms, but Istvan kept punching him, the blows glancing off his arms, but sometimes getting through, with Jinsey catching here and there a glimpse of his slack, troubled face. There was a moment when he thought he was about to fade from consciousness, and then it passed. His mind suddenly felt sharper, but also more distant, as if he were observing himself from the outside. He suddenly realized that Istvan might very well kill him. Istvan had been searching for something for a while, though he was never quite sure what. It was often like that, aimless, but he knew if he searched long enough it would eventually nudge his way out from the world he resided in, the world that was real, and come find him. Before, when his brother had been there, there had been things to pull him out, to interrupt his search, so that only rarely could he wait long enough for the surface of the world to peel back. But now he had all the time in the world. The first thing was to limit the world itself, to get rid of all unnecessary distractions, of anything and everything that did not encourage an arrangement that would crack the world open. Being out in the dome proved too much. There were signs and symbols there, patterns of all kinds, but they drew him in all directions at once. There were people there too who shook him and disturbed him and would not let him stay put. A pattern and arrangement out in the dome had led him back to his mother's apartment again, just as a pattern and arrangement in the apartment had first coaxed him out into the dome. A voice had come to him and told him to slit back the tape sealing the door, and told him to where his mother had hidden the key that would let him in. It was a voice that was not attached to a body, or if it was, he couldn't find the body. it was a voice that somehow was inside of him but separate from him too. He had left the pantry as it was. The pattern was good there. It had been made whole when he had left, though it was not complete in and of itself. He had arranged the couch just right. The coffee table he had left as it was, but he had used his fist to dent it further until his fist was bloody, and then had stared at his distorted gray reflection in its surface. There he thought the shadow man and waited for him to come out. Only he didn't come out. If it was the shadow man, he could not be sure if it was or was not yet, not until he came out. Maybe he was too gray and was another man entirely, or maybe it was nothing at all. And so, sitting on the couch, he had waited for hours, and sometimes bringing his face down close to the metal surface, but still unable to coax the shadow man forth. But after a time he had felt the pattern pushing at him. The pattern was right, but he was the one who was out of place. He had to be elsewhere for the pattern to do its work. So he had stood and stepped his way across the room and into the room that his brother he had once occupied. There in the bar room he waited. When it came, it would come now to find him. He stared at the door, patient, ready for whatever would come. How long he waited, how many hours or days, he couldn't say, but in the end there came sounds outside, and he knew the moment had arrived. He stood and pressed his ear to the door, and then when he heard footsteps approaching, he yanked the door open and grabbed what was on the other side and pulled it in. But no, it was not what he was hoping for, not what he expected. It was not something from the other world, but something from this world, an invader, an intruder, someone who had come to disrupt the pattern and to keep him from succeeding. Who had sent him? There were forces he knew out to disrupt him, forces that meant to keep him from finding what he was meant to find and fulfilling his purpose. They had been there at all moments, disturbing him. He shook this one, letting him know what he thought of him. To get him to tell him who was after him, who was trying to ruin him. He kept shaking. Yes, he told himself, he would get somewhere. He was getting somewhere. And then something struck him hard on the head, dazing him. The invader beneath him wriggled out from under him and away, and he saw at least 2 invaders now in the room. He scrambled up and away to face them, trying at the same time not to see them too closely, not to lose sight of the pattern, for if he lost sight of the pattern, then they would win. But there at last was the shadow man, curling there in the air, splaying from the feet of one of the intruders, the one who had struck him. The way to him was through the body of the intruder he knew. He shook his head and then struck out, and the intruder was beneath him, and the shadow man was beneath both of them, being held by the intruder. But if he tried to dig his way through him, then maybe he could get to him. The intruder was trying to speak, but no, he could hear a voice within his head telling him not to listen, and the other intruder was behind him now, striking him. But he was ready for that this time. He could keep his balance. it had happened. He had seen what he wanted, what he needed, and there would be no stopping him now.